1990 was the year the Soviet Union really began to fall apart. The Baltic republics were first to demand independence. In January, President Gorbachev went to Lithuania personally to try to calm things down.
It was a subdued Mr. Gorbachev who stepped onto Lithuanian soil, his mission to stop a division in the Communist Party escalating into the secession of a Soviet republic. On the drive into town, the banners demanded Lithuanian independence, but the reception for Mr. Gorbachev himself was cordial. The Soviet leader's first engagement paying homage to Lenin, the man whose vision of a united Soviet Union may now be in jeopardy. Mr. Gorbachev told Lithuanians on the streets that secession would damage Soviet security and leave the Lithuanian economy in a quagmire.
You can't break all the ties between us. History will show that that is a dead end. Discussions have already started about economic autonomy, about political sovereignty, but it's difficult and you can't solve everything at once.
So, with Mr. Gorbachev proffering both the stick and the carrot, and with Raisa offering her hand to the Lithuanian people, the whirlwind motorcade moved on an itinerary that's becoming almost an election tour.
But the citizens in the Baltic republics, in Latvia and Estonia, as well as in Lithuania, were not convinced by Moscow's arguments. They spent 1990 resisting them, as did the nationalists in the southern Soviet republics. In January, Muslim Azeris staged a demonstration that struck at the heart of the Soviet state itself. They began to dismantle the barriers on the border with Iran. The Azeris have also been at odds for generations with their neighbors in Armenia. Soviet troops had the almost impossible task of trying to keep the two sides apart. McDonald's came to Moscow and was an instant hit. It's the kind of entrepreneurial activity that's now being encouraged by the Moscow radicals. Moscow's very own McDonald's is the world's biggest. 20,000 people applied for the 600 jobs that were on offer. The catch is that a Big Mac costs the equivalent of half a day's average pay. Thousands obviously think it's worth it.
Mike Gatting's men taking the field, Saturday crowds bringing everything for a day out, as waves of protesters built up in Kimberley's black townships heading for the ground. Today, unlike yesterday, they had official permission to demonstrate just outside the fence. Police with dogs kept protesters and fans apart. Just a few spectators shouted back. One white cricket fan threw a bottle at the demonstrators. Both sides threw a few stones. No one was hurt, but as demonstrators started to go home, more stones were thrown at police and they decided on action. Only a short burst of rubber bullets near the cricket itself, but violence has spread back into the townships tonight. More stone throwing, black auxiliary police firing shotguns. Through all this, the cricket continued, but today has been the most violent of the tour so far.
The row over the rebel cricket tour and South Africa's participation in major sporting events in general spilled over to the Commonwealth Games held in New Zealand this year. Some African nations had threatened to boycott the Games. The athlete Sebastian Coe hoped they wouldn't.
Don't read a group of mercenaries travelling off to South Africa as being part and parcel of what we're doing here. We have nothing to do with it, and frankly, we're as ashamed of it as most of the African nations are.
The sun now seems to be shining on these games. On a perfect summer's evening, a 14-gun salute to welcome Prince Edward. Inside the stadium, there was a traditional Maori welcome. First, the ceremonial rubbing of noses, a hongi, followed by a full warrior greeting. The formalities over, in came the teams. All 57 countries expected to take part did turn up. The centrepiece of the ceremony, a symbolic recreation of New Zealand's history. The blue representing the sea, the white the surf as the first Polynesian settlers arrived. Then came the tall ships from Europe and the start of Western influence. And while all this was going on, in the centre of Auckland, about 200 Maori protesters were demonstrating about what they see as the continued occupation of their land. But the ceremony itself wasn't interrupted. The baton containing the Queen's message was brought in by Olympic gold medalist Mark Todd and Charisma, the best-known horse in New Zealand. Everything went exactly according to plan.
I now declare the 14th Commonwealth Games open.
The bigger budget ceremonies in Seoul and at other Olympics have set a high standard on such nights, but the organisers here have every reason to feel pleased.
St Mary's Anglican Cathedral, Johannesburg. The African National Congress celebrating after 30 years banned, just 1 week unbanned. Every day now the ANC rejoices in new freedoms, but with repeated calls for an end to all which remains of apartheid. The church Thanksgiving over, the crowd spilled out into the streets to be confronted by harsher realities. Police apparently impatient to break up any gathering they regard as unauthorized and illegal. A warning to disperse within 2 minutes was scarcely audible above the singing. The senior officer looked at his watch, and then the charge. The riot squad hit everyone in their path, including passers-by, scattering, shopping, beating people to the ground, beating people on the ground. We saw a policeman coming out of a shop, grinning, enjoying himself. The unrestrained violence used by the police today is in stark contrast to President de Klerk's stated aims of creating a peaceful climate for negotiations with the black majority.
They took me out of the taxi, and then they started to beat me.
None of this augured well for the release of Nelson Mandela, which by now was a matter of time, not intent. When that February day arrived, Mandela walked out of the gates of Victor Verster prison as he promised he would. His wife, Winnie, was at his side. After 27 years in prison, most of them in the notorious Robben Island compound, in the very harshest category of internment, Mandela looked remarkably fit, a very young 71-year-old. To the relief of the authorities, the whole occasion passed off peaceably and with great dignity. James Robbins attended the press conference given by Mr. Mandela just 24 hours after his first taste of freedom.
Nelson Mandela woke up to freedom this morning in the spectacular surroundings of Bishop's Court, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's official residence on the slopes of Table Mountain. His wife Winnie at his side, the ANC leader appeared for the world's cameras in what must be one of the world's most beautiful gardens. There could be no greater contrast to the bleak years on Robben Island and inside Pollsmoor Prison.
When the Queen toured New Zealand, there were demonstrations along her route by Maoris protesting about land rights. Someone threw a piece of cloth at the royal convoy, which caused panic among the security guards, but no loss of composure by the Queen herself. No damage was done, arrests were made, and the tour continued on schedule. In a year when devil dogs, petrifying pit bulls, roaring Rottweilers and the like made the headlines, it was something of a relief to see the judges at Crufts pick out a tiny West Highland Terrier as this year's supreme champion. The Westies win was a popular one. At least he didn't look like a biter, and the winning owner assured everyone he wasn't.
I utterly condemn the violent scenes which seem to have been organised by the militant tendency. They are precisely the same kind of violence we've seen before at Grunwick, in the coal strike, and at Wapping, and they're the negation of democracy.
But the attempts to blame the disturbances on the usual rent-a-mob minority were plainly misjudged, particularly at the demonstration in April, when 50,000 people descended on Westminster to lobby MPs and generally voiced their opposition to the tax. The scenes that followed in Trafalgar Square were some of the worst incidents of violence and destruction since the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in the 60s.